Hello and welcome to another Java video tutorial. In this tutorial we are going to extend on some of the work that we did in the last video, which was all about handling basic runtime errors in Java using a try and catch block. So I'll link to the video somewhere around the screen here somewhere, and there'll be a link to it in the description down below. So the idea is that we're going to use a try and catch block to do some user input validation. So one of the things that can happen when we're taking input from the keyboard is that we might want the user to enter in an integer value, and by mistake the user might enter in maybe an alphabetical value like the letter A or something like that. And that can cause a runtime exception in our program. So obviously we don't want that to happen. We want to be able to validate user input to make sure that the input that the user is giving us through the keyboard is the input that we expect, or that the program expects. So we can use try and catch blocks in order to do that. So what we'll do is we'll write a very simple program to start off with, and that takes some user input, and we'll see how some incorrect input can actually cause our program to crash. And then we'll go about fixing that using a try and catch block. Okay, so let's write some code. Alright, so what I've done is I've already set up a class called input test, and I've imported java.util.scanner because I'm going to be using the scanner class to take input from the keyboard. So basically what we're going to do is take in some integer input from the keyboard. So I'll need an integer variable to do that. So I'll say int num, for example, and I'll initialize it to 0. I'll give it an initial value. And then what do I want to do? Well, I want to probably prompt the user to give me some input from the keyboard. So let's do that. So let's say prompt the user. And we'll give out a little message on the screen to say system.out.print, and I'm using a print statement, not a println statement, because I want the user input to be on the same line as the message. So just a print statement, not a println. So I'm going to say enter an integer value. Okay, so that's prompting the user, and then what I want to do next is I want to actually read the value in from the keyboard. So read in value, and the way I'll do that is I'll use a scanner class to do that. So what I'll actually do is, just before I prompt the user, I'll set up the scanner class. I'll do that up here. Set up scanner. So I'll say scanner in equals new scanner. So we're creating a scanner object, and I want to take input from the keyboard. So I'll say system.in, and so that should set up our scanner for us. So now when I want to read in a value, I can say in, well, I want my number to get the value, so I'm going to say num equals in dot. And how do I read in an integer value? Well, it's next int. That will read in an integer value from the keyboard. So maybe in my comment I should say read in integer value. So I read in the integer value from the keyboard, and then what do I want to do? Well, I'll just output the message. I'll just output that number to the screen to show that we have indeed entered in a number. It's been stored in our num variable, and we can just see that on the screen. So I'll output the number entered by user, and to do that I'll just have a system.out.println, and I'll say you entered the number, and we'll output the number, which is stored in the variable num, Okay, so that's pretty much it. That's our program. So we've used the scanner class, we've set up the scanner class, we've prompted the user to enter in an integer value, so the user knows what type of value we're looking for. We've asked them for an integer value, and then we read in the value from the keyboard using num equals in.nextInt. So our number variable will be given the value that's read in from the keyboard, and then we just have a system output message down here just to print out the number to the screen. So very basic stuff. We will save that and compile it over here. So I'll say in my terminal window javac input.java. Hopefully there are no syntax errors. No, there aren't any syntax errors. So let's run the program. So java input test. So we are prompted to enter in an integer value. Okay, everything's good so far. And if I enter in an integer value, if I enter in the value, let's say I enter in 100, and I press the enter key on the keyboard, then we get our message, you entered the number 100, and everything looks absolutely fine. And in that case, the program didn't encounter any problems, and it executed and did what it was supposed to do. Okay, let's clear the window for a minute and let's run the program again this time. What I'm going to do is show you how it can very easily end up in a situation where we have a runtime exception and the program will crash if the user enters in an incorrect value. In other words, a value that we were not expecting. So I'll run the program again, and as you can see, we have our prompt enter an integer value. And if I enter in the value a, for example, and hit enter, you'll see that we get a problem. So we have encountered a runtime exception. So not a syntax error, not an error on compilation. The program has encountered an error while it was executing, and the error that it encountered was it expected to read in an integer value from the keyboard, and I typed in an alphabetical input, the letter A, and so it crashed. All right, so obviously that's a bad situation. We don't want that to happen. That could very easily happen by someone pressing the wrong key on the keyboard, and we definitely don't want our system to crash just because someone typed in an A instead of a 1 or something like that. So we're going to have to be able to handle those situations, and that's where user input validation comes in. So we want some way to validate the input that the user has given us on the keyboard to make sure that it is the type of value that we were expecting. And if not, then maybe we want to ask the user, oh look, please try again, enter in another value. We want to be able to handle that in a kind of graceful way, and we definitely don't want our program to crash because someone typed in the wrong value. So if we have a look at the error that we're getting here, you can see that it's an exception. It's a runtime exception, and the name of the error that we're getting is called an input mismatch exception. So what that error is telling us is just as I've described there. The input that we typed in, the input that the user typed in is the letter A, and we were expecting an integer. Our program was expecting an integer. So there's a mismatch between the data. We're expecting an integer, user typed in a letter. So there's a mismatch. So the error message is quite descriptive in this case. It kind of tells you what went wrong. Okay, so how are we going to handle this? All right, we're going to use a try and catch block, but there's a little bit more that we need to do on top of just using a try and catch block, because we have to think about what way we want to handle this situation. If the user enters in an incorrect value, do we want the program to just stop and for the user to have to run the program again? Probably not. A better way to handle it would be to just re-prompt the user, hey look, you entered in the wrong value, please enter an integer value, and just continue to do that until they enter in the value, the type of value that we're looking for. So there's a little bit more than just a try and catch block involved here, and we'll work through the process of building all of that user input validation into our code in the next few minutes. So the very first thing that I'm going to do is just kind of think about the type of input that we want. Okay, so just as an example, if we wanted some integer input, okay, well, what are integers? Well, you know, they're all the numbers, all the negative numbers and the positive numbers, including 0 as well, aren't they? So like we could have -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3. You get the message, and on we go. So they're the integers, right? What other types of input could we want? Well, sometimes we want decimal numbers, right? And we usually use doubles for that. So the types of input there are like 0.1, 25.54. What other values could we think about here? Maybe 0.001 or something like that. So we have decimal type numbers. And the other types of input that we typically take are kind of string input, right? So maybe we want someone to enter in their name, so maybe we want them to enter in their personal details into a program. So we might need them to enter in their name. So their name could be Stephen, and maybe we might want them to enter in their address or their favorite color, or something like that, or the name of their first car or something, or whatever. It doesn't matter, but it's a string value. Okay, now the thing about strings is actually that you know, string values are numbers, letters, and a mixture of numbers and letters. So for example, I could ask the user to type in a password. Okay, so their password could be 1A, or maybe 1A lowercase j, 99 lowercase k, maybe even an exclamation mark and an and symbol and an asterisk, and then maybe an @ symbol or something like that. So the password can be made up of a combination of numbers, uppercase letters, lowercase letters, and special symbols like exclamation mark or the and symbol or the @ symbol. So if we get the user to enter in a string, it can be a combination of lots of different things. So that's actually kind of a safe way to approach this problem, is that what about if we get the user to, if the input that we take in is a string, and then what we can try and do is try and convert that string into a number. If it's an integer that we want, we could try and convert that string into an integer number. Or we could try and convert that string into a double. Or if it's a string that we're interested in taking in from the keyboard, we can just accept it in as a string, because a string can contain anything, right? So we don't really have any particular validation problems around the string, unless you wanted them to enter in a date or an email address or something like that, and then you might do some extra validation on the string. Let's keep it basic for the moment, and let's think about those basic types: an integer, a decimal number or a double, and then string input. So the way we're going to handle this is we're going to be clever about it, and we're going to actually take in a string from the keyboard, and then we're going to try and convert that string to the type that we require. Okay, so as we work through the code, you'll see that it actually makes sense, and it's a nice way to handle this user input validation problem. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is we have our number. I want to now take in a string from the keyboard, so I'm going to need a string. So I'll say string, and I'll call my string str input. I don't need to initialize it with a value or anything like that. I'm still going to have my scanner class. I'm still going to need that, and I'm going to also need another variable here, and you'll see why in a minute. I'm going to introduce a Boolean variable called valid, and I'm going to set valid equal to false. The reason why I'm going to introduce this Boolean variable is because I'm going to use a loop to actually keep on asking the user for input if they get it wrong. So that's how I'm going to actually continuously drive the program until the user enters in an acceptable value, and then I can continue on from there. So I'm going to set up a Boolean variable, and I'm going to call it valid, and I'm going to initialize that Boolean variable to false to begin with. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is, after my where I declare my scanner class, or my scanner object, I'm going to create a while loop, and I'm going to say while valid equals false. Okay, so the idea is here is keep looping until valid input. Okay, so we want to keep on looping until the user enters in a valid input, and then if they enter in a valid input, the loop will break. So in other words, another way to say that is, as long as they keep on entering in an incorrect value, we want to keep on asking them to enter in the correct value. So that's the way we're going to do it. We're going to use a while loop to do that. Okay, so inside my while loop, what am I going to have inside my while loop? Well, the first thing that I want to do is I want to prompt the user to enter in a value, right? What kind of value do I want the user to enter in? I still want them to enter in an integer, still want them to enter in a number. So my prompt isn't going to change. It's still going to be the same. Prompt the user, and the user is going to enter in an integer value. Okay, so that's fine. And the next thing that I want to do is I want to grab some input again from the keyboard, right? So I'm not going to use this read in an integer value. I'm going to get rid of that. Oops, got rid of my while loop bracket there. Don't want to do that. So I'm going to say system.out.print enter in an integer value. Now here's the thing. I'm asking them for an integer value, but what I'm actually going to read in from the keyboard is a string value. Okay, so a little bit confusing, but you'll see where we go with this now in a minute. So we're going to enter in a string value. So I want to grab input from keyboard. Okay, so we're going to grab input from keyboard, and better spell grab correctly there. So grab input from keyboard. So I'm going to use my string variable to do that. So I'm going to say str input equals in dot. How do I read in a string from the keyboard? I use the next line method of the scanner class. So I'm going to say next line. So that's going to read in a string. Okay, as I said, a little bit confusing, but you'll see where we go with this. Now, reading in a string, as I said earlier on, a string can contain letters, uppercase, lowercase, numbers, special symbols like exclamation marks. It can contain a mixture of all those different inputs, even, you know, decimal numbers. We could have those in a string. Okay, so a string is probably the most flexible data type in terms of user input, and that's the reason why we're taking this approach of using a string to take the input. But what we're going to do next is we're going to try and convert the string that the user has entered into the data type that we require, and in this case that's an integer value. So the next line of code is going to try and convert the string into an integer. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we are going to use the integer class in Java. Okay, and that has a special method that tries to take a string, and hopefully if the string has the right content, it can convert that to a number, and it will give us back a number. So this is where my try and catch block comes in, because what about if the string didn't contain just a number? What about if the string contained a letter and a number, or a symbol and a number, or a decimal point and a number and a letter or whatever. When it tries to convert it to an integer, it's going to fail because it's not in the right format. So this is where I need to introduce the try and catch block to try and capture that runtime error that might occur, and then I can handle that gracefully and I can re-prompt the user to enter in the appropriate data type again. So this is where my try and catch block comes into play. So I'm going to say try. I'm going to have a try block. Okay. And I'll actually just put a little comment in here. I'll say try to convert string. Try to convert string to int. So that's what we're going to attempt to do in this try and catch block, right? As well as my try block, I'm going to need a catch block. So let's just put that in for the moment. I'll just kind of put a blank one in. Remember, for every try block, you need a catch block, an associated catch. Okay, so in my try block, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and convert the number. And I'm going to say num, so that's my integer variable that I declared earlier on, that this is the number that I want to actually take in the input into. So I'm going to say num equals. Okay, now I'm going to use a special class in Java called integer. Now this is different from a basic int data type in integer. The integer class is actually a class, and I can create like an integer object as well. But what I want to do is use a method in the integer class, a static method in the integer class, to parse to try and convert the string to an integer value. So the way I do that is I say integer dot parse int. Okay, so integer is a class in Java, an integer data type class in Java, and the method that I'm calling on it is parse int. So what it's going to try and do is it's going to look at the contents of the string that I'm going to give it, and it's going to try and convert or parse that content into an integer number. Okay, so I need to give this parse int a string as an argument. So what am I going to give it as an argument? Well, I'm going to give it this string value that I read in from the keyboard, right? So the user actually, they think they're entering in an integer, but they're not. They're entering in a string, really. I'm taking the input in as a string, and then this is going to try and convert that to an integer. So the input that I need to give it here is str input. Okay, so this is the key to how this is going to work. That line of code, num equals integer.parseInt, and I give the parseInt method the string that I read in from the keyboard. If the string is in the right format, if it's just normal integer numbers, it will work. If it's not, if it contains a letter or some other type of mixed input, it's going to fail, and it's going to cause a runtime exception. Okay, now what type of exception is it going to cause? Well, it's actually going to, of another bit of work to do in this try block, right? So if this line of code works, okay, if that line of code executes, we won't have a runtime exception, and the code will just continue on. So the next line of code after that, this is really important, and I almost forgot it. I need to set my valid equal to true. Okay, remember this Boolean variable that I set up earlier on? I initialized it to false initially, and then my while loop said while valid equals false, so it's going to continue looping around. Well, if this integer.parseInt method works and we convert the string to a number, we will not cause a runtime exception, and the next line of code after that will execute, and valid will be set to true, and it will break the loop. Okay, so this is where the loop actually breaks. If we get to this line of code, if we get to this valid equals true, well, then the loop will finish. Okay, So if the user gets it right first time, if the user enters in an integer number the first time, we'll only actually go through one execution of this loop. If they get it wrong the first time and then get it right the second time, we'll go through 2 iterations of this loop. If they continuously get it wrong and enter in letters instead of numbers, we'll continuously keep on going around and around the loop until they do get it right. Okay, so that's important. Then the next thing that I need to do is finish off this catch block. So the name of the exception that we're going to use here, the exception that we're going to try and catch, is called a number format exception. So number format exception, and I'm going to call that exception E. And all I want to do in this case is I don't want to do a stack trace or print out an error message from the system. What I'd like to do is I'd like to say system.out.println, and I'll say error, enter an integer value. So the user is going to get an error message, but it's going to be a meaningful error message that I'm actually going to output, and it's going to be informative. It's going to say, look, there's an error. You need to enter in an integer value. You obviously didn't enter in an integer value, so you need to enter one. Otherwise, we can't continue. So that's all that we're going to do in the catch. Now remember, this try and catch is inside a loop, and the loop will keep on going as long as the user gets it wrong. Once they get it right, then valid will be set to true. The guard on the loop will fail, and the loop will end, and our program will just continue on as normal. Okay, so there's a good bit going on here. There's a few steps involved in this process in order to validate the user input. So let's first of all compile the program. We'll run it and we'll see what happens. So I'm going to save it. Let's go over here and let's compile our program first of all. Hopefully I don't have any errors. No syntax errors. Okay, that's good. We're going to run it now, and the first time we run it, we'll get the input correct. Okay, so we'll say Java input test, and it says enter an integer value. So we get our prompt. I'm going to enter in the value 100 as I did before, and we get our message to say you entered the number 100. Okay, so everything worked that time because I was actually entering in a string. The input that I put in here, this 100 that I entered, was actually being taken in as a string value, and then we converted that string value to an integer using the line of code here, num equals integer.parseInt. Okay, so that line of code is taking this input that I typed in here, this 100, and it's taking that, it's a string, but it's trying to convert that string into an integer value. Now, did it work? Yeah, sure it did, because look at what I entered. I entered in the character 1, I entered in the character 0 followed by another 0, or the digits should I say. So the digit 1, 0 and a 0. Now can you convert that into an int? Yes you can, because it's the right format. So let's run the program again, and this time we'll get it wrong. Okay, so we'll run the program again. Again we get enter in an integer value. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in the letter A and hit return. Okay, no crash, which is good. Okay, but what do we get? We get an error message to say error, enter an integer value. So that's where our try and catch block is coming into play. The try had contained the code that was going to maybe possibly cause the runtime error, and the catch block has our error message in the event that the user enters in some other non-integer type value. So we get our error message, And again, the loop has come into play here because we are now re-prompted again to enter in an integer value. What about if I get it wrong again? Let's say I type in the @ symbol this time. So I'll type in the @ symbol and hit return. So again, we go around the loop again because the parse int method failed. The @ symbol cannot be converted to an integer number. So that runtime exception happened. We caught the exception, printed out the error message, and we're back around the loop again, re-prompting the user to enter in an integer value. So this time I'll get it right and I'll enter in 200 and I'll hit return. And as you can see, the digits 200 in a string can be converted to an integer number. So our parse int method succeeded that time in converting that string to an integer, and our valid was set to true. So the guard on the loop now is broken. The guard on the loop evaluates to false, and the program just continues on, and we get our little output message at the end of the program to print out the number that we typed in, which was 200. Okay, so if we have a look at this little example here, we've shown that you can use a try and catch block along with a loop and some other little bits and pieces to validate user input. And the way we approached it was we kind of asked the user to enter an integer, but we treat their input as a string, and then we see, can we convert that input into the data type that we actually require, which is an integer. And we use that loop mechanism and the Boolean variable to keep looping around until the user actually enters in the correct input. So this is a nice way to handle user input validation. But as you'll see, there's quite a few lines of code involved in this, and a loop and a try and catch block. So would you have to repeat this code every time you want the user to do some input? No, not really. There's a better way to do this, and we're going to wrap all this functionality up into a reusable piece of code called a keyboard class. So in our next video, what we'll do is we'll take the work that we've done here, we'll take this user validation code that we've written here, and we'll wrap it up in a class that will provide us this functionality that we can use anytime we want in any of our programs, and we'll be able to do user input validation without having to write all of these lines of code again and again and again. So that's in the next video, so stay tuned for that. That's going to take this user input validation to the next level and make it really, really usable. So again, if you've liked this video, please subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, hit the notification bell to make sure that you get the next video, because otherwise you're going to have to type all of these lines of code in every time you want to do some user input. And please leave some comments down below. As I said, all of the feedback that I get on the videos really helps me. At least it lets me know that people are finding them useful. And once again, I'll leave a link to the previous video in the notes below this one, so you can go back and have a look to see how try and catch blocks actually work in a little bit more detail. So that's all for now. Thanks a lot. Stay tuned, and I'll see you again next time.